What's up guys, and welcome back to Retro Gamer Gen X's Retro Gaming and Computing channel. And in today's video, we're going to be taking a look at 3 of the 80s and 70s most iconic computer companies and computers. Now, what this is basically just a compilation of all my history and a look at videos over the years, plus the ones I've done this year added into this video here. If you guys like these history videos, be sure to check out my generation 1 through 6 of the video game console history there. Now, unfortunately for you Atari fans, your BBC fans, you Sinclair fans, you Coco fans, your TI fans, unfortunately your computers aren't going to be in this video because I haven't gotten to them yet. So hopefully over the next year I'll start doing a little bit more of these retro or classic computer videos, because honestly I've been concentrating a lot more on the retro video game consoles, which we're kind of dwindling down. We're getting into the more rare and obscure consoles now, so I'm probably going to be tackling a lot more of these classic computers this year, so keep an eye out for those. But without further ado, let's go ahead and take a look at the history of these computers. The story of Apple Computer really starts in the 1950s. Steve Wozniak was born in 1950 in San Jose, California, and was raised by his mother Margaret and his father Jerry, who was an engineer at Lockheed Martin. A few years later, in 1955, Stephen Jobs was born. His childhood was much different. His parents, Joanne and John, were students at the University of Wisconsin at the time. Stephen's father was of Syrian descent and was Muslim, and that didn't go well with Joanne's father. But the two fell in love, and shortly thereafter, Joanne became pregnant. They decided together to perform a closed adoption, and Joanne flew to San Francisco to have the baby. During the adoption process, Joanne and John wanted the adopted parents to be college graduates. But as the search went on, 2 candidates that were not college graduates promised they would send the baby to college. These 2 were Paul and Clara Jobs, and baby Steve was adopted. In 1967, the Jobs moved to Los Altos, California to put Steve into a better school district. He started attending Homestead High School. In 1968, Woz graduated from the same high school that Jobs was going to, but at the time, the 2 Steves did not know each other. In 1968, Woz started attending Colorado University and studying their new computer science major. Computers always interested Woz, and he was a huge Star Trek fan, and this only added to his fascination. Getting his degree in computer science and electrical engineering was a dream he was fulfilling. But on one fateful day, the always joking and curious Woz got caught hacking the college's mainframe computer system. In 1969, he was expelled from CU and came back to California. He enrolled in the De Anza College in Cupertino and then transferred to the University of California, Berkeley in 1971. That year, for an engineering project, Woz and a young friend of his, Bill Fernandez, built a computer that they called Cream Soda. It was a simple machine consisting of TTL logic and an 8-bit microprocessor, really just chips and switches and LEDs. It was named after the Craigmont cream soda they drank from a local Safeway. Fernandez's dad was mayor and had the paper come out to do an article about the computer. While at the house taking photographs, a journalist stepped on a cord and shorted out the computer, destroying it, much to the dismay of Woz. Shortly after this, Woz was hired on by Hewlett-Packard to work on their mainframe computers. Ironic, right? Around this time, Jobs was attending Homestead High School. When he started there, he was more of an introverted kid that was more into electronics, but started getting into the arts and the hippie, stoner counterculture of the time. As he stated, "It was the first time I got high. I started listening to music a whole lot, and I started to read more outside of just science and technology. Shakespeare, Plato. I loved King Lear." He befriended Bill Fernandez, and the 2 were both interested in computers and electronics. Bill wanted to introduce the 2 Steves because of their shared interest in technology. They were introduced, and Jobs came out to visit Woz at Berkeley about once a week. During that summer, Jobs got a summer intern job at HP, and they became close friends. Then they met John Draper, or better known as Captain Crunch. Back then, long-distance phone calls were charged by the minute, and a way to cheat the system was found. The phone company's switches were controlled by tones. If the right tone was played at 2600 Hz, you could make free long-distance calls. In the late 1960s, Draper found a toy whistle that came in a Captain Crunch cereal box that could produce these tones. This was really the first form of hacking. It was called phone phreaking, and it fascinated Woz. Woz started to make an electronic version called the Blue Box. It was a device you could connect to the phone line to make a call, and it automatically provided the signal with the right timing to almost work 100% of the time. Woz, always a prankster, as a joke one time called the Vatican and asked for the Pope, saying he was Harry Kissinger. Jobs saw an opportunity in the Blue Box and wanted to start selling them. This was the first time Woz and Jobs created a product together to sell. Although highly illegal, it showed what could be done between the two. One time, they almost got caught with the devices when they got pulled over by the police, but the cops had no idea what they were and let them go. Now it was Jobs' senior year of high school, and he was really getting into the arts. So much so, he joined the theater club and did lighting and sound. This is where he met Chris-Ann Brennan. The two started dating and using drugs such as LSD together. Jobs was quoted talking about a pivotal moment in his life using the drug while in a wheat field. It was the most wonderful feeling of my life up to that point. After he graduated from Homestead, Chris-Ann and him rented a house with a friend until he left to Oregon to Reed College in September of 1972. Jobs dropped out of college just after one semester. He stated he didn't want to burden his parents with the cost, but he also didn't tell his parents that he dropped out. He stayed for the next semester, truly living the counterculture lifestyle, but he was convinced by the president of the student body to sit in on some classes. During this period, he was living off recycled Coke bottles, getting meals at shelters, and sleeping on his friends' dorm room floors. In 1973, Jobs came back to California and got a job working at Atari. Al Alcorn hired him on.
He was hired by Al Alcorn, and that afternoon, he came into my office as though that was the right thing to do. I said, "Hi, what's up?" He says, "I think you've got a really awesome company." Awesome. He uses that a lot. And he said, "I think that everything is pretty good, but I've seen your soldering connections, and they're really crappy." I said, "Well, let's fix them." And he says, "I will." So I put Steve on the engineering night shift, which there wasn't one. But it turned out that I was being a little tricky, because I knew he had a really good friend, Steve Wozniak, who was actually a lot better engineer than Jobs was. And so I got two Steves for the price of one.
While at Atari, Jobs saw a prototype for a new game that was not working correctly, and confidently he said that he could make it more elegant with less chips. Nolan made a deal with Jobs for $100 for every chip that he eliminated in the design. Jobs really had no idea how to do this, but he knew someone that could. He called up Woz, and over a few late nights at Atari, Woz created the game Breakout. Jobs made a deal that he would pay Woz half the money. The design eliminated over 50 chips from the TTL design Atari engineers had come up with. Jobs received $5,000 for his achievement, but he told Woz Atari only gave him $700, meaning Woz only received $350 for his work, which Woz didn't find out about till a few years later. In 1974, Jobs really started getting into Hinduism. Jobs and a friend named Daniel Kotke traveled to India to visit Guru Neem Karoli Baba in a drug-induced spiritual odyssey. That lasted for 7 months until he came back to the United States and lived at the All One Farm commune with his longtime girlfriend Chris-Ann and Kotke, all practicing Zen Buddhism. Jobs returned to California and his job at Atari in 1975.
So one day Steve comes into my office and says, I'm going to go to India to visit my guru. I said, well, wow, okay, well, good luck, right, if you get work. And so he goes off, well, he's going to go off to India, but we had a problem. We were selling these games international now, and when you'd sell them to Germany, let's say this, in this case it was Germany, so I said, hey, Steve, I got a deal for you. I'll send you to Germany for free. all you have to do is work one day with these guys, and then you go to India after that. It's got to be cheaper to get to India from Germany than it is here. He says, great, I'll do that. So Steve goes over. He doesn't even own a suit. And he goes over there, and they're shocked. They're all business people, proper German, and Steve is anything but. And to make matters worse, he solved the problem. And then he goes off to India. 3 months after he left for India, I get one of my engineers came in, Ron Wayne, and said, hey, Steve's back. I said, Steve who? Steve Jobs. Oh, yeah, I remember him, yeah. Well, bring him in. So Steve walks in, and I wish I'd taken a picture. He had saffron robes, shaved head, barefoot, Hare Krishna, and wow. And he said he had a trip in India, and he gives me a Baba Ram Dass book, Be Here Now, and says, can I have my job back? I go, sure, you got your job back. And then at that point, he and Woz had this stupid idea for a home computer. Steve Jobs offered me founder stock in Apple, and I said, I got enough wallpaper, but I'll take a free computer. Would that I had taken the stock.
During all this, Woz was still working at HP, but in 1976 he dropped out of Berkeley to pursue a career at HP in the calculator chip division. Always the prankster and entrepreneur, Woz also ran a call-in joke service. Callers would call his toll number and pay to hear the joke of the day. Once Jobs got back, Woz and him started to hang out once again. One of the places they went together was the Homebrew Computer Club. There, different computers were shown off and displayed for people to share their interests, trade parts, and purchase computers. Woz and Jobs wanted to create their own computer. They watched and learned from the different kits that were being shown. They started to design their own computer. Woz initially wanted the computer to run the Motorola 6800 8-bit CPU, but it was still too pricey at $170 per die. When Moz released the 6502 in 1976 for $20, Woz had his CPU. Woz spent his days working at HP and his nights in his apartment developing what would become the Apple Computer A. Initially, he designed the computer to use the 6800 CPU, but later changed the design to use the 6502 when it was released. But this meant changing the code to work on the new CPU. A true genius, Woz explained it was a simple process to convert the 6800 base system to the 6502. The 6502 and the 6800 are very similar chips, but the 6502 had a performance upgrade, giving Woz even more to work with writing the source code. But there was one problem. Since Woz worked for HP as an engineer, under his employee contract, anything he created was HP property. So he showed it to the HP suits, and they pretty much laughed at it, saying who needed a computer in their house, and also saying there was no market for the personal computer. Since HP didn't want it, the computer was theirs. On April 1st, 1976, the Apple company was formed with Woz, Jobs, and Jobs' former co-worker at Atari, Ron Wayne. Jobs wanted Wayne because he was an older businessman that banks and investors would like. He took a 10% stake in the company, but this didn't last long. Wayne sold off his share of the company back to Apple for $800 2 weeks later. He explained his departure because of a previous business venture that went south and cost him thousands of dollars that gave him cold feet on Apple. But during his time at Apple, he designed the first logo and the instruction manual for the Apple computer. They showed it at the Homebrew Club, and it was a success.
We had absolutely no idea what people were going to do with these things when we started out. Matter of fact, the two people it was designed for was Woz and myself, because we couldn't afford to buy a computer kit on the market. So we liberated some parts from Hewlett-Packard and Atari, and worked on a design for about 6 months and decided that we would build our own computer. So we built one, and Woz was up till 4 in the morning for many moons, and we got it working. We showed some of our friends. Immediately, everybody wanted one. And it turned out that it took about 40 hours to build one of these things, and about another 20, 30, 40 to debug it. And we had a lot of friends that worked at similar companies who could liberate the parts also. And we found ourselves spending every spare moment of our time helping our friends to build computers. And it was just getting to be a tremendous drain on our lives. So we got the idea one day that we could make a printed circuit board without the parts in it, sell these blank printed circuit boards to our friends and probably cut the assembly and debug time down to, 5-10 hours. So Woz sold his HP 6 calculator and I sold my van, and we got $1,300 together, and we paid our friend of ours who was this PC board layout person $1,300 to do us a layout, and decided we'd sell printed circuit boards at twice what it cost to build them and hopefully recoup our calculator and transportation at some later date. So that's what we did, and I was out trying to peddle PC boards one day and walked into a byte shop, the first byte shop in Mountain View, and Paul Terrell, the then owner of the byte shop, said he would like to take 50 of these computers. And I saw dollar signs in front of my eyes. But he had one catch, which was that he wanted them fully assembled and tested, ready to go, which is a new twist. So we spent the next 5 days on the phone to distributors and convinced the electronics parts distributors around here to give us about $10,000 worth of parts on thin air, just on enthusiasm. So we got the parts and we built 100 computers and we sold 50 of them for cash, and in 29 days paid off the distributors. And that's how we got started.
The part of the story Steve failed to mention is during this time, Apple was being ran out of Jobs' parents' garage. Since they didn't have anywhere near the amount of computers built that the order required, they needed help in producing that amount of boards for the byte shop order. So they hired on Bill Fernandez and Daniel Kotke to help out. When they brought the completed Apple A's, as they were known at the time, to the byte shop, the owner Paul Terrell had made a deal for the complete computer. Not just a motherboard, but a computer with a case, a keyboard, and a screen. Jobs had to talk him into honoring the deal, saying that he could make more money selling the individual parts himself with the motherboards, since Terrell had the supply of parts in the store. This gave Jobs the idea for their next computer, a computer with an awesome modern case and a built-in keyboard. Woz saw this as an amazing opportunity to improve on the Apple's design. They continued to sell the Apple I in computer stores at a price of $666.66. In all, 200 Apple I's were produced, and 175 being sold. The money was good, but not enough to design their next computer. However, Woz started designing improvements on the Apple A computer, including adding a cost-efficient colored composite signal from a glitch in the NTS signal he engineered. He also included more RAM, integrated some of the TTL logic, bringing the chip count down, and included Apple Basic on a ROM. This is when the first big-time disagreement between Jobs and Woz happened. Woz wanted to add 8 expansion slots and make it an open computer to the user. Jobs wanted 2 slots, one for the disk drive, the other for a modem, and it was supposed to be a closed system. They got into a pretty bad argument when Woz said, "Go get himself another computer." And Jobs knew Woz was serious and agreed to the 8-slot open system. Since coming up with the idea of a new Apple computer, Jobs was busy trying to find investors. Being turned down all over the place, Jobs contacted Nolan Bushnell. He suggested Jobs contact Don Valentine. Valentine wasn't interested either, but he suggested he call Mike Markkula. Markkula came to Apple headquarters, Jobs' parents' garage, and saw the production of the computers. He saw great potential in the fledgling company and invested $92,000 in Apple out of his own pockets while securing $250,000 in a line of credit. He also requested Woz quit his job at HP, which he did in November of 1976. With the investment made and a line of credit, things started to roll fast. On January 3rd, 1977, Apple Computer became incorporated. Jobs also had another demand for the system. He wanted it quiet. Since it would be in a case, along with the power supply, he didn't want a fan running to cool it. Traditional power supplies at the time could not do this, but a switching power supply could. He needed someone to design it. He hired a former Atari coworker, Ron Holt, for $200 a day. Jobs hired a freelance designer, Jerry Mannock, to design the case. Jobs was insistent that the case be of modern design, but he didn't want it to look like a computer. He wanted it to look like it fit in a house, like an appliance, but an awesome looking one. In February, Markkula hired on Michael Scott to be the first CEO of Apple Computer Incorporated.
From high technology, the computer store, introducing Apple II, the easy-to-operate home computer. Just hook it up to your TV to create dazzling color displays. Or you can balance your checkbook. Kids can teach themselves arithmetic. Or the family can invent their own Pong games. The possibilities are endless. It's called Apple II, the personal computer. See it at High Technology, the computer store.
On April 16, 1977, the Apple II was debuted at the West Coast Computer Fair. People were flocking to see the Apple booth to see the computer, passing booths of MITS, IBM, and Commodore, their main competitors at the time. It was a huge hit, and they started taking orders that day. Apple even secured a contract to supply computers to a Japanese manufacturing company. Only problem was, like the Apple I, it didn't have enough Apple IIs to fulfill the orders. This is when things really started to take off. Production moved from Jobs' parents' garage to actual factories. At this time, Apple ran a promotion to Apple I owners to trade their boards in to get a discount on a new Apple II. A lot of boards were traded in during the promotion and destroyed by Jobs, with only 82 of the 200 made known to exist today, making an original Apple I computer one of the most valuable computers in the world. It was also at this time that Apple started the change, specifically with Jobs. Woz had stayed the fun-loving, joking engineer, but Jobs was changing, and to the amazement of his close friends, he started wearing business attire. A huge change from the smelly hippie that could only work the night shifts at Atari a few years back. By 1978, due to the success of the Apple II, Apple started designing its successor, the Apple III. They wanted to quickly get it to market to stay ahead of the competition, IBM. The design team was led by Wendell Sander, but soon Steve Jobs got involved in the aesthetic design of the computer. It was his idea to eliminate air venting and fans for cooling to make the computer quiet. This, along with other design faults, caused massive quality issues with the Apple III when it was released. Woz was quoted saying that the design team was led by marketing and not by engineers, leading to the issues of the Apple III. All the while, Woz was busy designing an upgraded model of the Apple II, the Apple II Plus. This model would come standard with 48K of memory, expandable up to 64K with the 16K language card. Due to the 6502 processors only being able to address 64K, which was already taken up by the 48K of RAM, 12K ROM, and 4K of addressing I/O. The language card had to be bank switched to be addressable to the system. This allowed the user to load integer BASIC into the language card to be able to switch between integer and AppleSoft BASIC with just a command. Also, Apple's first disk drive, the Disk 2, designed by Woz, was released. Around this time, Jobs was informed his longtime girlfriend, Chris Ann, which was working in the shipping department at Apple, was pregnant with his child. Jobs vehemently denied this, stating it was not his and she had to be sleeping around, which was not the case. This was really the beginning of Jobs' mental spiral downward that would eventually see him ousted from Apple. Two theories that revolve around why this happened. One due to him being a foster child and not having his real parents to raise him, and it has been brought up that his heavy drug use earlier in life may have been a contributing factor. But to him, he could not be bothered with the distraction of being a father. After utterly being embarrassed by Jobs, Chrisann left Apple to have the baby at the all-in-one farm commune in Oregon, with no support from the millionaire Jobs. In May of 1978, Chrisann gave birth to a baby girl. Jobs worked with Chrisann to come up with the name Lisa, all while denying she was still his.
I'm here with an average American homemaker with her own Apple personal computer. Jill, do you use your Apple for household budgeting?
Actually, I'm working in gold futures.
Well, you could probably put a lot of recipes in there, huh?
Mm-hmm. And you can do trend analyses, generate bar graphs.
Are you really a homemaker?
Of course.
So Apple is the appliance of the 80s for all those pesky household chores.
I also own a small steel mill.
In June of 1979, the Apple II Plus was released and the original Apple II was discontinued. With the launch of the Apple II Plus, it expanded to other regions like Europe and Japan, with the introduction of the Apple II Euro Plus and the J Plus. Apple produced another version of this computer under license with Bell & Howell. A black Apple II Plus with added AV capabilities and marketed as AV equipment. By this time, Woz was already working on another improved model of the Apple II, which would later become the Apple IIe. Also in 1979, Jobs, Woz, and the head engineers of Apple visited the Xerox PARC campus to check out a new computer design. It had a graphical user interface and used a device called a mouse. The computer was a Xerox Star. Xerox made a deal with Apple to sell the technology to them for $1 million of Apple stock. The technology from this was used in Apple's first GUI-based computer, the Lisa, which was named after Jobs' daughter, although he denied it for years, saying that it stood for Logically Integrated Software Architecture. But in later years, he confirmed that it was named after his daughter. Jobs then moved on to the Lisa team.
Computers have always scared me. I grew up believing that only scientists and engineers could understand them. Then I started to work with Apple personal computers, and I learned how easy it is to use one. You can do sales forecasting and general bookkeeping and even financial charts and graphs. See? Frankly, at the moment, I have no reason to do all of these things, but who knows? Show business being what it is, I might.
Apple, the personal computer.
By 1980, the Apple III, which was deemed by Jobs as not the successor to the Apple II, but an enhancement of it for the ultimate hobbyist computer, was released. But unlike the Apple II, this computer was strictly marketed towards business and education, and not the home user. The cost of the unit was staggering, between $4,000 to $8,000 for the unit in 1980, which is between $14,000 and $31,000 in today's money for one desktop computer. This priced out the average home user. Cost and issues with the hardware were coming to the forefront. One of the main problems with the system is the lack of ventilation and fans. The system overheated, causing solder joints to come loose during operation, and crashed the overly priced computer. Apple's official fix for the problem was, get this, to pick the computer up off the table 2 inches and drop it onto the table to reseat the chips inside. No joke. This is what Apple sent out to Apple III users as an official fix. This did not bode well for the new computer or Apple's customers. For all it's worth, the Apple III was a great upgrade from the Apple II on paper. It had a 1.8 MHz Synertec SY6502A CPU and came with 128K of RAM, and had a hard drive in development. Due to the issues the computer was having, Apple went back to the drawing board and fixed the issues plaguing it. In 1981, they released the Apple III Revised Edition. This computer fixed the quality issues of the original and gave the computer the ability to be upgraded to 256K of RAM. Apple also started replacing customers' faulty original Apple III units. Later in 1981, Apple introduced the Profile, a 5 megabyte hard drive for use with the Apple III. In February 1981, Woz was piloting his Beechcraft airplane with some friends and crashed on takeoff. His 3 passengers and himself were injured in the crash. Woz took the brunt of the impact with serious facial lacerations, missing teeth, and head trauma. For weeks, Woz had anterograde amnesia, a condition that doesn't allow the brain to make new memories. Woz had no memory of the crash. He took a leave of absence from Apple to go back to school for an engineering degree. He said at the time, it was like a reset button was pressed in his head, and he just didn't enjoy design and engineering. At the time of the plane crash, Woz was one of the lead engineers on a new computer project, which would become the Macintosh. At this point, Jobs was pulled from the Lisa team and reassigned to the Mac project. During his leave, Woz went on to fund and create music festivals. This was not very lucrative, and he came back to Apple in 1983. During Woz's absence, Apple's first CEO, Michael Scott, was replaced by Apple's biggest investor, Mike Markkula, in 1981. Markkula really didn't want to be put in this position and was quoted as saying he would only stay for 4 more years at Apple. That didn't prove to be the case, as he stayed with Apple until 1997, serving in many different roles with the company. The last version of the Apple III was the Apple III Plus, which was released in 1983. It came with 256K of RAM, included a real-time clock and a redesigned keyboard, and it had an interlaced video port. But the damage had already been done due to the early quality issues and the price point of the computer. The Apple III went on to sell around 120,000 units in total and was discontinued in 1985. losing Apple over $60 million in the process. It was Apple's first commercial failure, with the ill-fated 16-bit Lisa having an even shorter lifespan, being discontinued in 1986. Big changes were coming to Apple in 1983. Apple replaced Markkula with John Sculley. This move was encouraged by Jobs. He even personally talked Sculley into leaving PepsiCo as their CEO by saying, "Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life? Or come with me and change the world?" This is a move Jobs would soon regret. While all this was going on, Woz and the Apple II team were ready to release the Apple IIe, an enhanced version of the Apple II Plus. This computer featured a redesigned keyboard with a built-in repeat function, full cursor keys, open and closed Apple keys, a new lowercase ASCII character set. It also came standard with 64K of RAM and implemented an auxiliary slot, which was used with the 80-column card to increase the memory of the computer up to 128K with bank switching, and gave the computer the ability to display in 80 columns. Also, they integrated a lot of the TTL logic that was on the board for a smaller chip count and greater reliability.
To reaffirm its commitment to this winning product, Apple has enhanced the Apple II to meet consumers' and dealers' broadening expectations about personal computing. Apple has taken the Apple II, refined its design, and added some of the most popular features available on personal computers. The result is the Apple IIe, a personal computer that is more reliable and easier to use. In fact, it's the most personal computer.
The Apple IIe was released in 1983 and became the most successful and longest-lasting computers Apple produced. With the help of the education sector, Apple found their way into almost every school in America, raking in the cash for the company. The Apple II team should have been rewarded for bringing in so much cash to Apple, but this is not what happened. Jobs was still working on the Mac project and had started to divide the company, the Apple II team against the Mac team. Bitter infighting within the company started, with the Apple II team not getting any accolades for their work, even though they were bringing in at least 85% of the profits for the company after the Mac launched in 1984. The board members were starting to take notice of the monster that Jobs had created within Apple.
Look what the computer wizards at Apple have come up with now. It has the power of these two computers, a built-in disk drive. It can run over 10,000 different programs. You get everything you need to hook it right up to your TV. You can even add a mouse. Introducing the Apple IIc. Now comes the real magic. You can take it home for under $1,300.
Also in 1984, the Apple IIc was released. It was Apple's first portable computer, portable being used loosely here. This was basically an Apple IIe in a smaller form factor. It came with 128K of RAM and an 80-column mode built in. It also had a serial port but lacked any expansion ports, the first Apple not to be expandable. They also upgraded the IIc with the Apple IIc Plus in 1988. The first upgrade was the addition of the 3.5-inch floppy drive instead of the 5.25-inch drive that came on the standard IIc. The last change was putting the power supply unit inside of the actual computer itself instead of having the external brick. In 1984, the Macintosh launched to much fanfare, but was not the success that Jobs had anticipated and the Apple board had its doubts about. This was due to multiple issues, such as the cost of marketing and parts, all of which really came down to decisions that Jobs made during the development. By 1985, the Apple II and Mac infighting at Apple had come to a head. Woz felt as if the Apple II team was not appreciated, and nor was he. He was quoted saying, "Apple has been going in the wrong direction for at least 5 years," and Apple had become the bane of his existence, and he missed the fun of the early days. Woz departed the company and sold most of his stock when he left Apple. With low sales of the Macintosh, the Apple II versus Macintosh interfighting, the loss of their most brilliant engineer, Woz, the board was looking for a way to get rid of Jobs. Then the final blow came with Microsoft's introduction of Windows. Jobs had basically given Bill Gates and Microsoft the keys to the Macintosh to develop software for it, trusting Gates. Microsoft reverse-engineered Mac OS and turned it into their own, Microsoft Windows. With all the blunders Jobs had made, it was time for a change. Jobs got wind of this and tried to stage a takeover of Apple, but failed miserably. At this point, he tried to resign, but his resignation was denied. The board put it to a vote in September and approved his resignation, leaving to form Next Incorporated. With the departure of Apple's founders, the story of the Apple 8-bits doesn't stop there. Production of the Apple IIe continued with the Platinum Edition. It had a few more upgrades to it, like the addition of a number keypad to the keyboard.
Dad!
Just a second, Martin.
Hey! Mom, come on!
Be out in a minute.
Hey! And you're not there.
I'm busy, Martin.
I don't care, I'm coming in.
Don't you dare.
An Apple II GS can do over 10,000 things for your family.
My computer.
Maybe even teach them to share.
But the biggest upgrade was the design that was started by Woz before he left the company. A computer that used the WDC65C 816 16-bit CPU, but was backward compatible to the 8-bit Apple IIe. This became the Apple II GS. It either sold as a new computer, or you could send your Apple IIe in and have them swap out the motherboard, backplate, and the PSU and turn it into a 2GS. In 1991, the Apple II card was introduced, giving the Mac Color Classic and the Mac LC computers Apple II compatibility. Really, it was an Apple II running on a card, allowing the use of the Apple II joysticks, paddles, and disk drives. The Apple IIe was finally discontinued in 1993 when John Scully was replaced by Michael Spindler as CEO, marking the end of the 8-bit era for Apple. From 1977 until 1993, Apple sold over 6 million Apple II computers, making it the best-selling computer made by Apple.
Are you keeping up with the Commodore? 'Cause the Commodore is keeping up with you. In a world of fun and fantasy and ever-changing views and computer terminology, Commodore is news. Are you keeping up with the Commodore? 'Cause the Commodore is keeping up with you. Are you keeping up with the Commodore? 'Cause the Commodore is keeping up with you.
The story of the Commodore 64 really starts in World War II Europe. Nazi Germany invaded Poland in 1939, starting what would become World War II. The Nazi occupying forces rounded up Jewish people in masses, in one of the biggest atrocities known to mankind. One of the families that were rounded up were the Trasmiels, Abraham and Rivka, and their 10-year-old son, Idik. They were incarcerated and were shipped off to the Jewish ghetto of Lodz. During this time, Idik was forced to work at a garment factory. World War II was in its infancy, but evil was growing at an exponential rate. The Nazis had determined that the final solution had begun, and the Jewish ghettos were beginning to be liquidated. At this point, Jewish people, along with the Trasmiels, were being shipped to concentration camps, better known as death camps. The Trasmiels were sent to the infamous Auschwitz concentration camp. It was here where little Idik and his father were examined by the angel of death himself, Yosef Mengele. Due to them being male and being physically able to work, both little Idik and his father were sent to the Alam labor camp, while Rivka was separated from her family and forced to stay behind at Auschwitz. While at this labor camp, Idik's father had died. Official Nazi paperwork stated he died of typhus, but Idik knew otherwise, blaming the Nazis for injecting his father with gasoline to kill him. Idik continued to work at the labor camp as the days turned into months and the months turned into years. In April of 1945, the 84th Infantry Division of the U.S. Army liberated the labor camp. Idik was finally free. By this time, Idik had spent 6 years incarcerated by the Nazis and was now 16 years old. In November of 1947, Idik changed his name to Jack Trammell and immigrated to the United States, where in 1948 he joined the U.S. Army. While in the Army, he learned how to work on and use office equipment such as typewriters and mechanical adding machines. After being enlisted for 4 years, he was honorably discharged in 1952. He moved to New York City and became a cab driver. In 1953, he secured a $25,000 loan to start a business from the U.S. Army Entitlement Fund. Jack had started a typewriter business, but needed to come up with a catchy name. Because of his time spent in the military, he wanted something that had a military title. And this is where he came up with the name Commodore. He named the company Commodore Portable Typewriters and began selling Czechoslovakian typewriters. This also became an issue, seeing that Czechoslovakia was a bloc country and was embargoed by the US. So he set up Commodore business machines in Toronto, Canada, and started having the parts of the Czechoslovakian typewriters sent to him so CBM could assemble them and sell them in North America. The business was never very successful, and by 1962 it was in financial trouble. Cheap Japanese typewriters were flooding the market, and the old Czechoslovakian typewriters were no longer profitable. At this point, Canadian businessman Irving Gold invested $400,000 into Commodore to relaunch the company as an adding machine business. Trammell and Gold started to work together, and Gold suggested that Trammell travel to Japan, their rivals, to learn why they were able to outsell American companies in America. During this trip, Jack saw the first digital calculators and decided that the adding machine business was not going to be profitable either. Commodore started producing calculators using integrated circuits from Texas Instruments, but Texas Instruments, being the savvy business people they were, saw Commodore making a profit off of their own chips and decided to make calculators themselves at a much lower cost. Because they owned their own chip fab, they could outprice Commodore substantially, and Commodore got burned again. But Trammell and Gold were not finished. Gold invested another $3 million into Commodore so they could acquire MOS Technologies, which was an IC design and semiconductor manufacturer. Now Commodore could make their own chips and compete with the likes of Texas Instruments. However, lead designer of MOS Technologies, Chuck Peddle, met with Trammell and told him calculators were not the future. Computers were. Trammell told Peddle to design a computer and to show him that his logic was sound. And this was the beginning of the Commodore PET computer, the first successful computer that Commodore had produced. It really was not a personal computer, it was more geared towards businesses and education. Trammell saw that other companies like Apple and Atari were selling personal computers with color graphics, and he needed to do this to stay competitive. Commodore's Bob Russell designed the VIC-20, a personal computer with color graphics. The VIC-20 was the first personal computer to sell over 1 million units, and was Commodore's first big success. In 1981, MOS Technology started a project to create the next-gen sound and graphics chips. They were named SID, Sound Interface Device, and VIC-2, Video Integrated Circuit for Graphics. The SID chip was designed by Bob Yanes, and the VIC-2 by Al Carpenter. The new chipset was first used in the Commodore Ultimax, designed by Commodore of Japan's Yash Chikara. Now, this was an interesting system. It was designed as a game console using the chipset, but only had 2 kilobytes of RAM, no BASIC, and only used cartridges or a tape drive. So this was really a Franken console, half computer and half game consoles. So like a lot of game consoles in the early 80s, they just couldn't make up their minds what they wanted this to be. It wasn't very successful, and only a few units were produced for the Japanese market. It was about this time that Russell, Yanes, Carpenter, and Charles Winterbull, manager of MOS, pitched the idea of a low-cost successor of the VIC-20 to Jack Trammell. The VIC-20 was successful but underpowered. Trammell wanted to create a low-cost, powerful personal computer with stunning graphics and sound, and he wanted it to have 64 kilobytes of RAM. But RAM at this time was still pretty pricey and would make the computer very expensive. But Jack knew the market, and by the time this computer was being produced, the cost had reduced significantly. It was at this point that Jack coined the phrase, computers for the masses and not the classes.
At the lowest price to the masses. Mm-hmm. We are a company which we like to sell to the masses, not to the classes.
Okay. Well, The The project was named the VIC-40. The computer was to be shown at the 1982 CES show in January. The team worked for months over Thanksgiving and Christmas to complete the hardware and software for the project. They had completed it by January of 1982, just in time for the show. It was in the same case and used the same basic ROM as the VIC-20. It was shown at CES for a selling price of $595, and the crowd, along with Atari reps, went wild. How could they sell such a powerful machine at such a low cost? The same way Commodore had been priced out of the calculator market, now they own their own chip fab, bringing Commodore's cost per unit down to $135, giving them a huge profit margin. Commodore was competing with the likes of Atari, Texas Instruments, Tandy, and Apple. Within a matter of months, a pricing war started. The price of the C64 was reduced to $299. Most of Commodore's competitors lowered their prices as well. Texas Instruments lowered the cost of the TI-99 to just $99, taking a loss on each unit. And by October of 1983, TI pulled out of the personal computing market. Commodore got its revenge on TI for what they did to them in the calculator market years earlier. But not all things were great for Commodore in the C64. Early production models had a high failure rate due to a defect in the PLA design. This was corrected in later revisions, but the damage had been done. In fact, rumors started circulating that the C64 would be discontinued by 1985, but sales of the unit stayed strong as Commodore continued to revise the motherboard and cut costs, and bring those savings to the consumer. Rumors of its discontinuation fell flat as sales rose. Then in 1984, during a closed-door meeting, Jack Tramiel and Irvin Gold had their final falling out. It's not clear what really went on in this meeting. Some have said Tramiel wanted his sons to be on the board and have control over the company, while Gold disagreed with that. Some have also said that it was Gold stating that he didn't like how Tramiel was running the company. Everything had to be approved by Jack, and projects were being put on hold because of this. And years later, after Jack's passing away, his son stated what was really said during this meeting. Jack had brought up how Gold was using company assets on himself, cars, jets, trips, etc., instead of investing it into the company. Jack told Gold, "You can't do that while I'm president," which Gold said, "Well, goodbye." 3 days later, Jack resigned from the company he worked so hard to create. This left Gold in charge of Commodore. Also during this time, there were several models of the C64 created. In 1983, the C64 bread bin was introduced. Also, Commodore released the all-in-one unit, the Educator 64, for use in schools. In 1984, the SS64, a portable C64, was introduced. It was intended for the on-the-go businessman. In 1986, Commodore released the redesigned C64C, the same computer but with a revised motherboard and redesigned case. In 1987, Commodore released the C64 Aldi, which was a C64 with a C64C motherboard in a bread bin style case, and were sold in German Aldi discount stores. The last true C64 model was introduced in 1989 and was the C64G. These were basically like the Aldi, but had a lighter case color. These were sold in the European market. The very last iteration of the C64 was the C64GS. It was released in 1990. This was a C64 that was consoleized and used only cartridges and had no keyboard. This product wasn't very successful, only selling 20,000 units. Also, there were two spin-offs to the C64, the Commodore 128 and the C65. The C128 was introduced in 1985 and was fully compatible to the C64, but it was a vast improvement with 128 kilobytes of RAM and had a Z80 coprocessor so it could run CP/M if needed. The C65 was to be a 16-bit successor of the C64, but still compatible, but not 100% compatible due to chip incompatibilities. The project started in 1989, but was discontinued in 1991 due to the competition within the company of Amiga and the fact that computing was starting to move into the 32-bit generation. By 1990, the 8-bit computer was all but obsolete. Commodore's leadership and Irving Gold was blowing money at a rate that Commodore could not keep up with, since the sales of the C64 had slumped to almost nothing and Amiga sales were struggling. Then the failed project of the C65, Amiga CD32, and the multimedia Amiga CD-TV basically did the company in. In March of 1994, Commodore announced the discontinuation of the C64 in 1995, but the company itself didn't make it that long. In fact, a month later, Commodore filed for bankruptcy, and all products were discontinued, including the C64, as the company was liquidated. The C64 had an amazing 11.5-year run, from 1982 to 1994. Sales of the unit are kind of misleading. Some say that they only sold 12.5 million units, while others claim that they sold over 30 million units. I'm sticking to the fact that they sold over 30 million units, making it the #1 selling personal computer of all time. What a truly amazing story for such an amazing computer.
And now the best new rock performer of the year is
Stevie Palmer.
Thank you very much. Oh my gosh, did it get over here? Isn't that your next door neighbor?
What a surprise. I'd like to thank my agent, my arranger, and Sheena, the girl next door.
The Amiga computer. Professional video production at amateur prices.
Stevie, you rodent.
Amiga from Commodore. The computer for the creative mind.
For the history of the Amiga, I could literally sit here and spend an hour just talking about the development, the people involved, and the chipset. It'd be way too long and drawn out of a video, so I'm going to do a condensed version. All you Amiga fans, just bear with me. I'm trying to fit this all into a short video, so we'll see how this goes. Now, if you guys have watched my Atari 2600 video, you would recall that Jay Miner designed the TIA chip. He ended up leaving Atari in 1979 after Bushnell left and Warner took over. Miner wanted to develop a next-generation console using the Motorola 68000 CPU, and Atari wanted to live in the past, still using the 6502 base processor for their next console. Later that year, Larry Kaplan left Atari and went on to form Activision. Kaplan was then approached by some investors who wanted to develop a new game system. Kaplan hired Miner and formed a company called High Toro. They started to develop a system codenamed Lorraine. Kaplan left the company in 1983 and Miner was promoted to chief engineer, and the company was renamed Amiga. By 1983, a breadboard version of the Lorraine was created, and it was ready to be shown at the 1984 CES show. During the demonstration, they didn't have an operating system ready yet, so they created a 3D bouncing red and white ball, the Amiga logo that we all know and love today. Unfortunately, even though it was an advanced system, it really didn't catch on, and only one company showed interest in it, and that was Atari. Now by this point, Amiga was running out of funds and needed some quick cash. Talks were ongoing with Atari. Atari loaned Amiga $500,000. Now this loan was short-term and had to be paid by the end of the month, and if it wasn't, then Atari would own the rights to the Lorraine system. This is where the story gets interesting. In 1983, Atari lost over $1 million in 1 week due to the video game crash, and was just siphoning off money left and right. Warner wanted out at this time. In 1984, Jack Tramiel resigned from Commodore, and a lot of engineers went with him. They went to Atari and started to develop their own 68000 base series computer. This is where the two timelines meet. Atari needed a 68000 base series computer, and Amiga had one. Amiga was broke, and Atari thought they had a deal done with the loan Amiga couldn't pay back. This is when Commodore stepped up. Commodore paid off the loan to Atari. They initially tried to complete a $4 million deal licensing the Amiga. But then they offered to buy the company outright for $24 million. Amiga agreed to that, and the rest is pretty much history. By this time, the breadboard prototype of the chipset were now in IC form. In 1985, Commodore released the computer as the Amiga from Commodore, but that name was later changed to the Amiga 1000. Unfortunately for Commodore, sales of the system weren't very good. They were selling, but not as well as expected. Commodore had went all in on the Amiga, so CEO of Commodore, Thomas Ratigan, decided to release 2 versions of the Amiga as a marketing tactic. One was a high-end system that had major amounts of expansion, really more for the video and audio production professionals. The other version of this computer, using the same chipset but on a cost-reduced motherboard, was to be released for the low-end market. Those two machines were the Amiga 2000 and the Amiga 500, both being released in 1987 and went on to become very successful machines. But the Amiga 500 sold many more units. The A500 went on to be the best-selling Amiga computer Commodore produced, selling between 4 and 5 million units.
Game over, man. It's game over.